We have many interesting and cutting-edge topics on today's agenda, and we will be starting off with the first plenary session titled Merger Review in the Digital Economy. And now I'd like to pass the floor to the moderator of this session, Mr. John Peckman, former Commissioner of Canadian Competition Bureau. So, Mr. Peckman, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much. I want to start by thanking the JFTC. Hello, this is working? Okay. I just want to start off by thanking the JFTC and the other co-chairs, the US FTC, as well as the UK CMA, for hosting us today at this workshop, for the kind invitation for me to speak. It's
signs people can't hear you.
It's an exciting event for me. It's my third time here in Japan at an ICN event, starting with the Kyoto. Back it was an annual conference that took place. So this one is especially exciting because it's my first time as an NGA. So I've changed teams, and changing teams, and now I'm on the side of open and free markets, innovation, and efficiency. Probably should sound familiar, but that's the team I'm on. And I have a new mantra as well, which I picked up immediately, was agencies can do it better, agencies can do it faster. So on the theme of agencies doing it better, we have an excellent panel today to discuss the issue of mergers in digital markets, which of course are it's a very topical area. We have people that have in-depth experience who can help us all do better reviews. So let me introduce the batting order for today, picking up on the chairman's baseball analogy. To my left is Andrea Gomes da Silva. She's the Executive Director, Markets and Mergers at the UK Competition and Markets Authority. Herbert Fung is to my far left. He's the Director, Business and Economics, Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore. And in the middle is Nuno Rocco de Carvalho, member of the board, Portuguese Competition Authority. And I do want to apologize. Cristina Cafaro was scheduled to be on the panel as well. She's deeply disappointed. She had some complications with her flights and was unable to attend. So the panelists are going to be able to spend a lot more quality time with you that are here today as a result. So there is a small upside to Christine missing it. She had a number of important messages she wanted to share about the importance of agencies taking a more vigorous approach to merger review in the digital economy. So again, we're going to miss her, but as I said, the upside is our panelists here will have more time to talk about some of the issues they're going to be raising. So by way of background, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the rise of data-driven markets. The OECD did a study a couple of years ago where they found that these markets can lead to winner-take-all types of outcomes, which would likely increase concentration. And there's also been a number of broad industry studies that also suggest that industry concentration has been on the rise. And as a result, agencies around the world are engaging in self-reflection on digital mergers, such as what are the effects that we should be focusing on? Are we focusing too much on price effects? Should we be looking more at innovation? Privacy, the issue of startup entry, and how do we assess the acquisition of data? How much data is too much data? Given the Internet of Things, there's data everywhere. So how much is too much where we have to take action? Really difficult questions. What's the appropriate analytic framework for startup mergers, for nascent companies that are being bought out by the IT giants? Are we catching those? Are we finding out about them too late after they've already closed? Are notification regimes sufficient to identify these transactions? And are we properly assessing platform mergers? Again, they're different, they're two-sided, number of issues surrounding that. And in Canada, the Competition Bureau did undertake a study of big data, issued a report in February of this year. It was award-winning. Concurrence gave it an award, basically concluding that the current tools available under the General Application Framework of Competition Law in Canada is flexible enough and principled enough to deal with a number of the emerging issues in the digital market. It's just, how do we do it? How do we develop those frameworks? And I think that's the big question for all of us. And, as populism rises, the concern about big is bad. Governments are now intervening with some of the agencies. You've heard the announcement this week in Japan, where the Economics Department and the JFTC will be doing an in-depth investigation of the big IT giants, again, suggesting that the government is looking for more from the competition authorities in this area. And mergers, obviously, are an important area. Have we not under-enforced? Have we allowed these IT giants to acquire market power? And the purpose of merger review is to stop that. And so have we allowed anti-competitive mergers to go ahead? So the pundits believe that the growing concentration is a result of under-enforcement, and we're focusing too much on price effects. But then the agencies also have to balance that against the question, if we take too aggressive action, are we going to harm innovation? Are we going to dampen the benefits of product improvements and the efficiencies from network effects? So our panel today is going to help us with some of these questions. I don't think they'll have all the answers, but they've done some very good work to help us reconsider some of our approaches going forward. So the format today is each of the panelists will do a very short presentation, followed by a Q&A session. I'll open it up to the audience, and then we'll have additional questions from myself if the audience is satisfied with the presentations they've seen today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you, John, and thank you very much to Chairman Sugimoto and the JFTC team for inviting us and for hosting what I hope will be an absolutely fascinating conference. I think it's fair to say that global merger enforcement is undergoing something of a midlife crisis. So there have been comments globally about concerns that there has been perhaps consistent under-enforcement in a number of sectors. And that applies to traditional sectors where a number of them globally do now show very, very high levels of concentration. And I think that concern becomes even more acute when we start to think about the world of a digital economy. So our own chief executive at the CMA said just a week or so ago that he wondered if one of the decisions of our predecessor in the Facebook-Instagram merger had perhaps been naive. And the European Commission's chief economist, speaking in a personal capacity, again just a week or so ago, said that he thought Facebook had perhaps had an easy ride with a couple of its acquisitions. I really shouldn't be talking about digital mergers if I can't even operate my slides, but there we go. Getting carried away. So that is all about the past, but I think that soul-searching inevitably leads to the question of, if we as agencies have got it wrong, can we do better in the future? And do we have in our toolkit the correct tools, both legally and analytically, to review mergers in the digital world? So are they fit for purpose, or is there a gap in that toolkit? And in something of a perfect storm, there are also broader questions that the world and we are wrestling with, a number of which are obviously not directly related to competition. So fake news, scams, and also concerns about privacy. So what are the challenges that we face? Well, I put them broadly in two buckets. One is a legal bucket, and the other is an analytical bucket. I'm a lawyer, so I'll start with the legal bucket, because I always feel slightly more comfortable. And really, I see two parts to that. The first is, do agencies have the jurisdiction in the first place to review some of these mergers? And I'll come back to that in a little more detail. And then secondly, if you think of the evidential standard, so in the UK, at phase 2, which is how we review our more complicated mergers, the correct standard is on the balance of probabilities, so more certain than not. What sources of evidence do you need to adduce in order to find a concern with a merger on that basis. And I will come back again a bit later to some of those sources of evidence. On the analytical side, what tools do we use to assess the potential effects of a merger? So if we go back to jurisdiction briefly, it was notable that the European Commission, with its turnover-based threshold, did not have jurisdiction back in 2012 to review Facebook's acquisition of Instagram. And in fact, it was only able to review the subsequent acquisition of WhatsApp because of a funny rule in the European system, which says that if 3 member states have the jurisdiction to review a deal, they can, in certain circumstances, send it to the European Commission for them to review instead. In contrast, our predecessor, or one of our predecessor organisations, the OFT, was actually better placed in terms of establishing jurisdiction. And that's because we have this very strange test in the UK, which is called the share of supply test. And that enables us to review a merger where the merging parties would have a combined share of 25 or more in the share of supply of goods or services. And importantly, that is not the same as an economic market. So it gives us a very wide margin of discretion in terms of calling in a merger for our review. And it was using that limb of our test that we were able in 2012 to review the acquisition of Instagram, which at the time had, I think, 13 employees and no revenue. Google Waze, which was the following year, so 2013, Waze's turnover was 0.5 million pounds sterling, none of which was in the UK. But because the parties had a combined share of something which we called turn-by-turn navigation applications for mobile devices, which rolls off the tongue, we were then able to review that merger. If we come back to the evidentiary threshold, where in the UK, as I said, the burden is the balance of probabilities, what type of evidence will really allow us to capture some of the long-term and inherently uncertain nature of the effects in these fast-moving markets? So if we look now at the analytical challenges, and in the interest of time, I'm only going to touch on a couple of those. In mergers outside the digital space, we usually focus on effects in terms of price or perhaps quantity. And the virtue of those, particularly for economists, is that you can measure them, and that is a good thing. The same is not true when you start to look at effects perhaps around innovation. It's very, very difficult to observe and to quantify. And I guess the question that we're all grappling with is, does that prove fatal for our ability to bring a case in those areas? So as a lawyer, I'm perhaps less concerned than some economists about the problems with measuring an effect, because, I'll touch on this a bit later, it is in principle, in my view, perfectly possible to bring a probative case by triangulating other sources of evidence. So, in short, in my view, I don't think it's fatal. The other point I wanted to touch on is the difficulty of assessing the counterfactual in digital mergers. So, by definition, the past is unlikely to be a particularly good guide to the future because of the pace of innovation and change. So that is certainly one issue. And then the other is ex post. How do we know whether we ever got it right? So interestingly, I was reviewing the OFT's decision in the Facebook-Instagram merger in preparing for this panel. And there, the consistent evidence that was received from third parties was that users' eyeballs were simply not on the Instagram app for long enough to make it worth monetizing. So the view then, based on that evidence, was that there was just nothing that advertisers would be interested in. Now, if you were to look at the amount of advertising revenue through Instagram today, I mean, I have no idea what it would be, but it would be a very, very big figure. And the question there is, did we, on the basis of what third parties told us, get it wrong? Or in fact, has Instagram become what it is today because it's in the Facebook stable and has had access to that funding and those technological developments? I don't know, but for me that exemplifies, I think, one of the real challenges in this space. So I said I'd come back to some of the alternative sources of evidence that I think we could usefully draw on in this space, given the difficulties about measuring some of these effects that I was just touching on. So if we see startups with little or no revenue being bought for billions, I think there's a very simple question we should be asking ourselves, which is, what is the acquirer hoping to get, or perhaps what is the acquirer hoping to get ahead of? And there are a number of ways that we can try to find an answer to those questions. So valuation models can be a very, very good source of evidence as to what the acquirer is planning to do with the business. And if you can compare that with valuation models produced in earlier years without factoring in the target business, you can learn some really interesting things. You can also interrogate the rationale for the business by looking at internal documents. You could also add to that what analysts in their reports are saying about the real purpose of the transaction. And I'm not suggesting that agencies should rely on any one of these in isolation, but back to what I was saying earlier, it's a case, to my mind, of triangulating those sources of evidence. And if you see a consistent picture emerging that is consistent with a theory of harm, then I think, in principle, that goes quite some way towards helping you towards the correct answer. So I think you'll have gathered that I'm relatively optimistic, at least insofar as the UK is concerned, of our ability to operate in this space. But that doesn't mean we should be complacent. So I thought it might be interesting just to run through a handful of the things that we are doing. We've commissioned some external research. It's research and evaluation of previous cases to look at potential approaches going forward for looking at mergers in this space. And I think in particular to try to draw out some conclusions about the appropriate set of metrics in this sector. We've also recently established a data and digital team, and there are a number of elements to the work that that team will be doing. They will be helping us, first of all, understand in more detail how businesses use data and algorithms in their work. And then also they will be working, if you like, on a more internal basis to help us use perhaps data and algorithms better in our work. So are there parts of our work that we could automate that would make it better and more efficient? So back to John's point about being able to do things better and more quickly. There seems to be an area that we could fruitfully explore. The other thing that we have done that has given, I think, some cause for optimism is that we just last year applied our traditional merger analysis tools to a merger in a two-sided market in the digital space. This was the merger of Just Eat and Hungry House, which were two online food ordering platforms. So you had the classic scenario where from the purchaser's perspective, the purchaser of food, the person wanting to order their dinner, these apps are free. But on the other side of the market, restaurants were charged to be on these platforms. We cleared the merger, and one of the factors which contributed to the clearance was a belief that Deliveroo, which was already in the market but was relatively recent entrant would expand and provide some really meaningful competition. And in the immediate aftermath of our clearance, shares in Just Eat went up by 10%, which, for those of you of a nervous disposition, might make you think, oh, these people got it wrong, because that's what often happens. But interestingly, not long after, the shares fell again. Why? Exactly because Deliveroo, after a few months, had expanded quite considerably, in line with the prediction that we'd made. And then finally, as a lawyer, I do also draw some optimism from a fairly recent decision of our specialist tribunal, the Competition Appeal Tribunal. So they were reviewing a vertical merger, which is not sort of particularly in the digital space. It was the merger of ICE, which is an exchange, and Trayport, which was a sort of key input for traders and a number of other participants in the market. And it was a fairly plain vanilla theory of harm. It did also have a prospective dynamic element to it, in that the evidence suggested that in the past, Trayport, so the input, had actually used its relationships to foment and shape competition between exchanges. And so our concern was that going forward, ICE would own that input and be able to foreclose and prevent it acting in that way. And the decision was challenged, but it was ultimately upheld by the court, including in respect of this dynamic element, where they found that there was no obligation on us to say specifically when that element of foreclosure would occur, or which of the various means of foreclosure that we'd outlined would occur at a particular point in time. And so from that, I don't want to count my chickens, as we say in English, but I draw some comfort that there is judicial approval for, provided there is evidence, intervening where there are more dynamic and prospective theories of harm. Thank you.
So thank you, Andrea. You've provided us a very good overview of a number of the important issues, and we're going to save questions for Andrea after the other presentations, but I have the right as moderator to ask the first one. And I know there are many case handlers in the room that worry about the details. And the evaluation project, to me, is, as a former case handler, is very interesting to understand the metrics the CMA intends to use to determine the harmful effects, to what extent will you be looking at the efficiencies from these transactions on the ex-post review? Where will you get the data, post-closing data? That's always a challenge. Then ultimately, will you be posting the results? Because often agencies are concerned about ex-post reviews because the results can be embarrassing. So a few questions there for you.
Sure. So we have committed in our annual plan for the past few years to carry out one ex-post evaluation. Last year, we did one looking at how we had treated entry in a number of cases where entry had been an important factor. And we published that, and I think we managed to do that without embarrassing ourselves. So I'll leave you to decide if you look at it. And so this year, actually, it was a very, very timely. It turned out to be a very timely decision to carry out this particular piece of work in relation to mergers in the digital economy. So there's going to be two elements to this piece of work. The first is a sort of research piece where. Sorry, I should have said, we are not doing this work. We have commissioned a third-party consultancy called Lear to carry it out on our behalf. And we put out quite an extensive invitation to tender. There are a number of participants, and we've provided some guidance as to what we would like to get out of it and what sources of evidence we think might be available. But ultimately, it's for them to carry out the work in what they think is the most meaningful way possible. So there are two elements to the work. One is the research piece, where they will be looking not only at the decisions we have taken in the digital space, but also ones that other agencies have taken. So, for example, the European Commission. And that will simply be a research piece that says, these were taken, these were the sectors, these are what the conclusions are. The evaluation piece will be only in relation to our decisions and those of our predecessor organisations, so that they are just marking our homework, not another agency's homework. And they will have full access to the case files that we used in those in those cases. We, with consent of the parties, we would hope that they would also be able to hold a series of follow-up discussions to understand what has changed, whether some of the predictions came true, etc. That said, and I think this goes to one of your points, John, I doubt very much that we will be able to get a perfect benchmark against which we can assess the counterfactual and what came to pass. But I would hope that we would get a clearer sense of the appropriate metrics for intervening in different, analysing different mergers in these sectors. We hope that the report will be ready in our spring next year, which I know for some of you will be autumn, and we will certainly be publishing it on our website.
That's excellent. It's a really important initiative, and I know will give a lot of direction to agencies. So with that, we'll turn it over to Nuno.
Thanks, John. Let me just begin by thanking the Japan Fair Trade Commission in the person of Chairman Sugimoto and all his team. I'd also like to thank the ICN and the co-chairs, the CMA, Andrea, her team, the US FTC. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first workshop. I am on the board, so I usually attend the more international policy meetings, so it's good to be with you here in the weeds, as John puts it. And I'd just like a final word of thanks before I get started to John, not only for moderating, but for all his work in his previous capacity at the Bureau and for the ICN. I was listening to Christine earlier, and I was just thinking, I mean, there are actual physical people who made ICN happen, and John was really important to the whole process, so thanks, John. So, not going to take too long. I was just wondering what to say about the digital economy when I'm speaking after Andrea. And my issue here is, what are we actually talking about when we refer to digital economy in the competition space? We're at a competition workshop. We're not talking about politics and fake news, and we're talking about competition. So why are we concerned? Why is this a specific issue? My feeling is that basically this is all about a simple thing called the internet. We're worried about the impact the internet has in changing the way in which consumers relate to companies and vice versa. The consumers in order to satisfy their needs for goods and services, and companies just for profit. How has this been transformed? Or how has this been, what are the impacts of this to our work in competition in general and to merger review in specific? So, I mean, e-commerce has really shaken up the way that we define markets, how we assess the effects of a merger, and geo-blocking notwithstanding, we see the rise of these platformers. I understood in Japan you call them platformers, which have really had an effect and are now being compared to the robber barons of the 19th century. Are we overstating the case, or are we actually understating the case? I don't know. This is what we're trying to find out. I mean, when search engines came along, they seemed like really neutral instruments of just working how the internet worked and being on, you remember Netscape? Nobody thought that was a big deal, right? Social media, that was like a novelty. It was like something you use for dating or a little less than dating back in the day. And now they're challenging us to think about competition in post-price terms. I'm not talking about non-price. I'm talking about post-price. What is post-price competition? And I mean, all of these issues were already simmering, and they were brewing with the rise of internet. But my personal feeling is that all of this suddenly came to a head when we have this almost overnight ubiquity of smartphones. I mean, Smartphones mean that the internet is not something like you log on at home or at the office. It's something that's permanently in your life. And now we're in Japan, so people are very respectful, and I don't see many people on their smartphones. But if we were in Europe, I would say that half of you would be looking at your smartphones right now and proving my point, but you are respectfully not doing that. So the lines between our physical life and our online activity are blurring still further with virtual assistants, Internet of Things, augmented reality. One of these days we've got virtual reality. It's not that far off. You got machine learning, artificial intelligence, and these buzzwords just keep popping up all over the place. And the issue is, it's kind of getting overwhelming. And what do we do? How could we cope?
That is deliberate, you might want to say.
So the bombs are flying, and they say just keep calm and carry on. I think basically my message here is not that different from Andrea. So the transformations that are being brought about by digital economy, they present daunting threats. But there's no reason to panic. I'm just echoing Andrea's comment here. The tried and tested methodology of merger review still holds true. The legal regime does not have to be overhauled overnight. But as we brace ourselves to deal with these challenges of reviewing mergers with a digital footprint, the message is that we first need to refine our tools, maybe more from an economic challenge of how we review cases, rather than redefining our rules. So we're running behind, and I'll just, for the sake of brevity, keep this very short. Just want to make one general point and then just go over a particular case. So the general point I want to make is that we are getting we sometimes risk overstating the dichotomy between digital and physical markets. The example I got there, the Amazon Go brick and mortar store. So Amazon is going brick and mortar, and this local produce in the village where my mother-in-law lives is going online. But at the end of the day, merger review is about case-by-case analysis. That's the main gist of the point that I wanted to make. So it's we need our teams to be up to date on economic literature. They need to be fluent in digitalese. We need to get to know the past experience, both nationally and internationally. And here, ICN is absolutely crucial. But at the end of the day, we need to look at the cases just as we did in the physical markets. So the case I wanted to bring to you, and I will speed this up, was basically a transaction between a buyout of the two main classified ads websites in Portugal. So these basically work like classified ads of newspapers. I don't know if they're popular here in Japan. In Portugal, a lot of people buy and sell secondhand stuff through these websites. And actually, the number one was buying the number two, and number one is basically a household name. We actually refer to OLX as the way in which we do this buying and selling of secondhand stores. It's become a household name. And this has a challenge in terms of product definition market, because we had to adapt our SNP test in order to define markets, because we find that traditional SNP tests are not able to take into consideration the quantity effects of multi-sided markets. But the message is that the theoretical framework of SNP is still valid. We just need to be more in tune with how we're going to measure switching behavior by consumers. And I would totally echo Andrea on this. For us lawyers, that's not an issue. I mean, the law is not about getting these very foolproof, safe criteria. It's about triangulating and getting the facts straight and making a reasoned judgment. Sorry, I went a little too fast there. Back, okay. So in terms of geographic market, that was a major challenge, because of course market participants and merging parties will always state that they're in the internet, so that means that they're competing worldwide. But of course, you need to have in mind that linguistic and cultural barriers matter a whole deal. They tend to define markets inherently. And then there's the physical aspect. And in this case, it was very marked, because I mean, if you're buying and selling second-hand goods, that means that you actually have a physical transaction occurring after the two sides of the market are matched on the platform. So that has that is very meaningful to how you define geographic markets. Here we had 99% of sellers were based in Portugal, resident in Portugal. The sites were posted in Portuguese language, and it was actually only possible to advertise on these websites for products being delivered in Portugal. So we naturally defined it as a national market. In terms of competition assessment, and moving on very quickly, we found that we didn't have to apply any innovative instruments. We just had to adapt the SNP framework, so to speak, not the test, but the framework, the logic of competition assessment, in order to find out what the market power was here. So what we used in terms of metrics is we looked at site visits, where both of the merging parties represented more than 75% of site visits to this kind of website. The page views were in excess of 85%, and it's viewership that actually generates value for advertisers. But we also confirmed this with time on site, which means that we looked at how much time people were spending on each of these websites as opposed to other alternatives, and which was a greater than average rate, whereas the bounce rates, which is basically how much time people are then moving on to the next website rather than exploring. So here's much lower than average, so people are spending a lot more time there. And basically, what we found is that there was these self-reinforcing effects of brand recognition and the indirect network effects going on here. So they become self-reinforcing. In the end, we adopted a decision to go to phase 2, and the merging parties just decided to drop the case. Now, this might seem frustrating, but at the time, the feedback we got from the companies was that they basically agreed with us. So when they went into the merger, which is really, I mean, it bolsters your confidence that you took a right decision, but it also leaves you kind of edgy, because that basically meant that OLX was pretty confident they could just outgrow Kustjust, which is basically what happened. So they're empirically speaking, I mean, the market share of OLX keeps growing. The platform effects, the winner take all, runs its course, and I don't know, maybe someday in the future we'll have an abuse of dominance case here, but there is an indication of when you're trying to be careful with the digital space, you can get the instance where even if you are too critical of mergers, time will have it just run its course. So I'll just leave my questions for how we should be redefining our rules, because I do think that although I'm advising to keep calm, there are points where we need to discuss redefining our rules, but maybe leave that to the Q&A. I'd just like to close this by stating that I think that there's the discussion to be had. The breakout sessions we have lined up are very stimulating. It's just a pity that we can't clone ourselves in order to be at all of the breakout sessions. So I'm hoping to have the chance to interact with you today and throughout the session. So, domo arigatou gozaimasu. Thanks.
Thank you, Nuno, and I know you were a bit rushed on that, and I do apologize. It's the format we have today. But just a follow-up question regarding your comment you made that your authority, the case handlers, have digital expertise and are developing digital expertise. And as you saw in Andrea's presentation, the CMA is establishing an expert team, a data team, They're looking for people outside the organization who understand how digital markets work and how these companies operate, and also conducting the ex post reviews to help with their understanding of digital markets. Curious what Portugal is doing in this area to improve the digital expertise of its case handlers and the team.
Okay, let me give a two-parted response, or a two-person response to that. I mean, we're a small organization, obviously, and I mean, the big cases in terms of digital space will still be handled by the Commission, market share thresholds notwithstanding. But basically, it's about the people you have and the way you stimulate people to work together. 2 points. We have the competition authority hired somebody just to take care of, well, basically the IT structure of the competition authority back when the competition authority got started. But nowadays, he's handling, and he has a team handling forensic ITs in antitrust cases, access to file, and more he's getting involved with the substance of cases and helping our case handlers work through the whole issues of how digital economy works. Second element is the case handlers themselves. In this case, OLX is a case I like a lot because I remember being approached by the lawyers for the merging parties, and they were just comfortable with, although their transactions had just collapsed, they were comfortable enough because their clients, which were both foreign companies, had been convinced by our case handler, Pedro Marques, who was handling this case and helping me prepare for today, how knowledgeable he was of how these markets worked. And Pedro Marques is not an IT specialist. He's just somebody who is passionate about competition and realizes that one of the great things about competition is that you have to get dirty and understand. I mean, just the other day, Tommaso Valetti was speaking about Dow DuPont and how people in the Commission became experts on agronomy. So, I mean, that's the competition work, and digital shouldn't be different than other, like pharma or other complicated industries. That's all.
Okay, thank you for that. No, so Herbert, I'm going to ask you the same question before you get to your presentation regarding what the Competition Commission in Singapore is doing to enhance its expertise in the digital markets.
Sure. So just like CMA, we recently set up our Data Monitoring and Analytics Unit, DMAU. But unlike CMA, we're not yet hiring external experts in data scientists, etc. We are internally double-heading for the new unit. So, for example, I'm appointed to supervise the unit, probably because I'm an economist, and between lawyers and economists, there's a general feeling that economists are more comfortable with numbers and data. So
I don't know what you mean.
and now I find myself doing word analytics all the time.
That's great. Okay.
The Singapore Civil Service provide excellent training by the more advanced agencies such as the Infocom Development Authority, their chief data scientists. They have excellent experience, so we are cross-learning from that regard. And obviously, we will be speaking to the data team at the CMA very often going forward. Just to highlight some interesting projects we have done in food delivery business. There was a worry about exclusive agreements between the platforms and the restaurants. So we wrote a code to crawl the restaurant list of Foodpanda, Deliveroo, Uber Eats, etc., and match the restaurant names and addresses. And we found out that the majority of restaurants in Singapore can list themselves in 2 or 3 platforms. So we use data to conclude that the worry about exclusive agreements were not borne out by data. So just to highlight some nice examples as a start, many exciting projects ahead.
Terrific. Okay, Herbert, so to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for the organizers, JFTC, Chairman Sugimoto, and the Merger Working Group for hosting this fantastic workshop in this fantastic location. Like Tokyo very much, and special thanks for drawing the curtains, otherwise you will all be enjoying the Tokyo Bay and the beautiful Rainbow Bridge instead of listening to us. So thank you. So my presentation will focus mainly on recent major case for us, the merger between Grab and Uber. So I understand that some of you may be interested in it. Of course, this is only one type of the many kinds of digital mergers, but I would rather focus on a case that we have actual experience, and I can fortunately defer to Nuno and Andrea for other types of digital mergers. And of course, as Nuno has said, there's no separation between the digital and the physical world. So this merger was as much digital as physical because it involved cars, drivers, and commuters physically commuting themselves from one physical location to another. So just to echo Nuno's view. We're not usually that cautious, but since Uber has just filed an appeal against us, so I do have to say this is in my personal opinion and not CCCS's. Then now I can say anything I want. So just a bit of background about the ride-hailing platforms in Singapore. So very simply, Grab, Uber are legal in Singapore. They can operate legally, and it is already everyday life in Singapore. According to our Transport Ministry, the number of private hire vehicle rides is double that of taxi rides in Singapore. So there are more private cars than taxis in Singapore. Just to share how ubiquitous private hire vehicles are in Singapore. So last month I hosted a birthday party for my daughter. So a couple of her friends came. So at the end of the party, the parents are supposed to pick up their kids. But instead of physically appearing, a couple of them sent me screenshots of Grab booking. Please put my kids to this car. The problem is I received 5 or 6 of these screenshots, so I have to do some matching. This kid, okay, this car, and that kid, that car. So it is everyday life for this service in Singapore. So here I showed a market share chart. Before the merger, Grab about 50%, Uber 30%. The remaining 20% include taxi rides. Just to clarify, in our market definition, we include taxis that were booked through platforms and phones, but excluding street hail, and that was based on evidence. So timeline for this case, it started in March. For those of you who were at the ICN annual conference in New Delhi, I think many of us attended the party at the Roof Terrace Bar celebrating Mr. John Peckman's retirement. So 1 hour later, I received a phone call from Grab and Uber. And next day, I was back in Singapore, and that was the beginning of my past 6 months. So today, having John again as my moderator, does give me a sense of destiny. So very importantly, the parties announced and consummated the transaction right on the day of announcement, only notified us 14 days later, attempted to notify, which we rejected because we already started the investigation. We issued an infringement decision in September, including remedies and penalties. So just to clarify, we have a voluntary regime. So we impose penalties not because of the failure to notify, but because they actually completed the merger and the merger actually caused harm in the market for a duration. So that was the reason for the penalties imposed. As I mentioned, Grab just filed appeal. The proceeding is still ongoing. So I just try to draw a few interesting points based on the experience of the case. First one is challenges to merger regimes because of the intangible nature of digital mergers. So Uber, for example, is just a platform. I'm sure many of you will have heard people say the biggest hotel in the world does not actually own buildings. That's Airbnb. The biggest taxi company does not have cars. That's Uber. So they don't have physical assets. All they have is the platform, the network. That poses challenge to us in terms of the merger notification regime, especially when they decide not to notify and straight away consummate the merger, how effective it is, even if we impose interim measures. For example, traditionally we can count on whole separate provisions, or later, if the merger is anti-competitive, or the reverse of the transaction. So I'm just showing a picture of what happened in Singapore right after the announcement. Uber merely said that we will shut down our app after 2 weeks. They didn't even shut down the app from day one. Within 2 weeks, we will shut down the app, and that was the announcement. Next day, a massive exodus of drivers queuing at the Grab center, trying to register themselves with Grab. It is not the traditional kind of integration of merged parties where the companies transfer the contracts and the employees from one building to another. Uber didn't even make an effort to transfer the drivers. The drivers themselves, reacting to the news, decided themselves to terminate with Uber and sign up themselves with Grab. So if we talk about imposing interim measures to hold separate or to order unwinding of the merger later, these drivers change jobs of their own accord. And the merging parties knew that there are no other choices, so the drivers naturally would just move next door. But if we ever want to impose a whole separate or unwinding, does it really work in the traditional sense? So it's a challenge for us. So when the merger was announced, internally we wonder, was this really a merger, or was this a pay for exit agreement? So simply I pay you and all you do is just to exit. We're not even integrating operations. Unfortunately, there was quite a bit of urgency that we have to act, and we have limited time to consider a novel theory of harm. So this case proceeded as a merger, but I think it's still an interesting question. What's the nature of this kind of transactions? These are some of the challenges to the voluntary regime in Singapore, because it's not an obligation for the parties to notify. I will talk about whether a mandatory regime would work better subsequently. Another interesting point I want to share is that we talk so much about two-sided platforms, the cross-elasticity effects. Things are quite complicated when we have an actual case. For those who are familiar with the Uber's business model, you will know that the commuter, the rider, will pay a trip fare to the driver. The driver will pay a commission to the platform, and then the platform will provide promotions, discounts to the passengers in terms of $3 if you enter this promotion code, etc. We have a very interesting question. We asked ourselves, what really is the price for this platform? And do we include the entire trip fare, or just the commission that is earned at the platform level? Do we deduct promotions as part of turnover, or treat it as the cost, business cost, that is not part of the turnover. It's very controversial, and I'm just putting across that these choices have very real implications on, for example, what is the turnover, relevant turnover for the case. When we perform SNP tests, UPP tests, what is the price we are testing on? When we impose remedies related to prices, what price are we talking about? And when we impose penalties, penalties is based on turnover, which is a function of price. So all these have very important implications to that. And I understand that the parties did not notify some of the mandatory regimes because they argue that the relevant turnover is based on the lower version of the prices that they define, and as a result, the turnover falls under the turnover threshold of some of the mandatory regimes, which is debatable, but the problem is if they can just buy time for 1 or 2 weeks, then they can effect some of the effects of the merger that might not be reversible. So voluntary and mandatory regimes alike were subject to some of these challenges. This is the final point I want to make. Some of the speakers on the panel have talked about the importance of price versus non-price effects. It's very instructive. But within the domain of price tests, and I just wish to put across that price test is based on market definition, and traditionally our market definition is based on demand and supply substitutability analysis, which we can define specific services in a platform to be a relevant market, such as what we did with the ride-hailing market for the merger case. However, when we speak to these businesses, clearly they see themselves competing at the platform level. They keep emphasizing that they don't just look at ride-hailing, but I have 2 screenshots. The first one is Grab in Singapore, and the other is Gojek, based in Indonesia, but very likely will enter the Singapore market very soon. If you look at their platform as the interface you see from your mobile phone, clearly they have a suite of different services. So when we talk about whether price cost analysis is relevant within a specific relevant market, does that reflect the business reality? For example, these platforms will tell us that the ride-hailing business is very important to them to acquire a user base, which later they can monetize in food delivery, mobile payment, etc. So in this kind of business model, is it important to say that the price of the ride-hailing business is above or below cost? Or is it more important for them to acquire the user base with some cross-subsidy and later monetize within the ecosystem of their platform? So increasingly we see companies competing in ecosystems rather than in relevant markets. So another challenge for us. Let me just stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions from the panel or from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Herbert. If you don't mind, I'm going to kick it off and ask you how the agency treated the network efficiencies during your merger review from the transaction, because obviously when 2 platforms merge, there are significant scale economies. And curious if that was a factor at all in your decision to challenge the transaction.
Right. You are very right. Network effects indeed features significantly in the Grab-Uber merger, and I can imagine it can feature heavily in many digital mergers. There are theories of harm and theories of efficiency benefits. Theories of harm being with the network effect, it is very difficult for new entrants to amass critical scale to compete effectively. And on the benefits side, there are network efficiency benefits. Particularly, the parties argue that with a bigger network of drivers and cars, we can reduce waiting time for passengers and improve the utilization of cars running around the streets. What is important here is to look at the evidence and the data in making your decision rather than just relying on theories. So for example, we examined the network efficiencies argument and we found out that so you need a certain critical mass to reduce the waiting time and the utilization of cars. That is for sure. But looking at historical data, very early on, both Grab and Uber have achieved such critical mass beyond which there were no obvious further improvement in terms of waiting time and utilization. So we concluded that even before the merger, the efficiencies have been achieved, and therefore we cannot attribute incremental efficiencies to the merger. So that was indeed a significant part of the decision. On the harm side, we interviewed potential new entrants, drivers, and we concluded that there is network effect. And if drivers can multi-home, meaning that if they can use two platforms, having two mobile phones in front of the screen, then the network effect is present but not insurmountable. But if they can only use one platform at a time, then the network effect will be very strong. So correspondingly, we impose a set of remedies to ban the exclusive agreements such that the platforms cannot require the drivers to only use my platform at any point of time. So our remedies corresponded to our analysis on network effects, and in particular, multi-homing is important to make sure there is effective competition within the network effects in this market.
Excellent answer. So we have less than 10 minutes, and we do want to make this a workshop and interactive. And so I'm going to throw the floor questions to the floor. If anyone wants to ask a question of our expert panel here, we have a hand up at the back.
So it's Tom Boylan from the ACCC, Australian Commission. I just had a question. Did Singapore consider getting an injunction to prevent the shutdown of Uber? Because we've had a case where we have won an injunction to prevent shutdown, but it was quite a controversial matter.
Yep. So first of all, we have the power to seek injunction. We did impose a set of interim measures, as I showed on the timelines of the case, but that did not include an injunction to prevent the shutdown of Uber. Instead, we imposed an interim condition for Uber to extend the shutdown date from 14 days to about a month. That is because of the reality that I talked about. Even if Uber is not shutting down the app, we have seen drivers having already reacted to the news and of their own accord decided to change jobs. So we have to consider the practical significance that Uber store remain open but everybody knows that this is not sustainable. So we make the practical decision to impose a set of interim measures that were meaningful, and we did not consider an injunction to be part of it.
Joel?
Thank you. So Nunu and Herbert, you've spoken very eloquently about recent cases where you've looked at essentially mergers where both participants are active and reasonably well established in the market. I wondered whether you had any thoughts where the competitor is either in a neighbouring market or is slightly more nascent and has the potential to enlarge its share and its participation.
So I did that one. The issue is why haven't we had those cases? Maybe I think a lot of the issue turns on what John and Andre also addressed, which is the issue of whether our notification regimes are fit for purpose to catch these potentially very important cases of nascent acquisitions. I'd just like to stress that we have in Portugal we've kept the old market share threshold regime, not as complicated as the share of supply. So basically, it's the same. Well, it's still a difficult process of working out exactly how do you define a market in order to establish what the market share is. But we have a pure market threshold, and then we have a mixed turnover and market share threshold, and that allows us, at least when we're talking about nascent companies which are carving out a certain market where they already have at least some turnover, but they have like 100% of the market, and then you will have these takeovers taking place. At least you can capture them. But then there's the whole other issues. Even if you capture them and they're notified, how will you analyze them? Up to now, they have been, to our mind, pretty straightforward. We haven't seen issues where we believe that this will have a detrimental effect, where the mergers are killer acquisitions in the lingo, so to speak. But there are definitely challenges there in terms of how we analyze that. I'm hopeful we can get in the breakout sessions on an analytical framework to go into that, because there are challenges for sure.
Herbert, do you have anything to add on that point of potential entry and neighboring competitors that aren't part of the relevant market in those
I think
acquisitions?
Nuno has pretty much covered the points.
Okay.
Good. It is a tough question. Yes.
Lebo Paladi from the South African Competition Commission. Andrea, you spoke earlier about a merger regarding sort of the platforms in respect of restaurants and looking at Deliveroo and them as a potential entrant that would disrupt. I mean, how do you then balance sort of a new entrant telling you that, or at least get information from them that they will likely, become a competitive constraint, versus sometimes you get new entrants who puff themselves up as if they're going to become big. For example, Theranos in America. Because that becomes very difficult analysis. So I just want to understand how you analyzed that in order to ensure that constraint was actually real and she was realistic.
Sure. So that was a case where, exactly because of the concern that you've just highlighted, we used our compulsory information gathering powers to ask Deliveroo for their information. So we use those very readily to get information from merging parties, but we always ask ourselves the question when it comes to third parties whether it's proportionate to do that. And precisely because of the criticality of their evidence of entry to the case, there we did use those powers. And I mean, without going into precisely what they provided, that we were able to see what they had done already, so how quickly they had grown, how they had signed up restaurants, the type of structures that they were using to do that, and we're also able to gather other evidence that gave us comfort that prediction, in inverted commas, was a valid one.
Can I just add something with your question? I mean, when Andrea was saying, she was using the Deliveroo example of how they had got it right, I would have said that even if Deliveroo hadn't expanded, the CMA would still have gotten it right. Because at the end of the day, we are analyzing the ability. We're looking at barriers to entry and expansion rather than the actual crystal ball prediction whether the expansion will occur or not. So we need to keep in mind that what our work actually is not about predicting the future, is making an educated guess.
On that note, we're at time. I think we've warmed you all up in terms of raising some really important issues in the area of digital mergers. And as you know, there are a number of breakout sessions. So please, it's a workshop, engage, exchange best practices. I want to thank the panel for doing such an excellent job today. Please join me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all of you.